Hey everyone, and welcome to our May live event for National Quilter Circle. We have Colleen here to answer all of your quilting questions, so thank you for being here, Colleen.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be back for a while.
Of course. I mean, you've had a busy morning so far. You've already taught a Facebook class for us. Now we're going to have you answer some questions. So it's just a busy quilt morning for you.
Yeah.
So we actually have a couple questions that have come in already and some comments. Dawn says she made it on time finally. So welcome, Dawn. We're glad that you're here watching. So if you have never watched a live event before, for the next hour, you can ask any sort of sewing and quilting related question that you would like Colleen to answer, and she'll do her best to answer all of those. So one that came in earlier is from Margaret, and she would like to know how you calculate the amount of fabric to buy for a quilt.
That is a really good question. It also depends on how many fabrics actually are used, different prints within a quilt. For the project that I did earlier today, I was using a packet of pre-cut pieces along with background, border, and binding. So if it's something that goes with a pre-cut, it probably will tell you in the instructions, usually 1 or 2 packets of a pre-cut. It will list then how much background and border fabric. But if you need to actually double check that, it's actually sitting down, looking at the instructions of how many pieces, say for border, you want to maybe even increase the size of a border, then find out how many cuts that they're asking for. So for example, in a border for a quilt may ask you to cut 6 strips at 6.5 inches wide. So you would have to multiply 6 times 6.5, and that will tell you how many you absolutely need. You're always going to want to add at least 1 more cut, because there's always that time when, the rotary cutter and the ruler decide to part ways and we don't get a straight cut and we need to make an adjustment or correction. So always kind of put in a buffer so that you have at least 1 more cut. A lot of times people will, when I'm working in the quilt shop, and they'll say, well, I want to make my border, wider. I want to make it 8 inches instead. So then we would take maybe, for example, 6 times that 8-inch width. That's 48 inches. So you're well over 1.25 yards to 1.33 yards. An extra cut is going to mean probably getting like 1 2/3 or 2/3 or so in there. Everyone has a different comfort zone though, because sometimes I'll calculate for someone and they'll say, just take it to 2 yards.
So, just round it up. Yeah.
Just round it up. Having leftover fabric is never usually an issue with quilters. We always like having plenty of fabric to work with, just in case we change our minds on something and want to use it somewhere else. So it's really sitting down with the math, figuring out how many cuts are made from a certain size, and doing kind of a word problem that we did back when we were in 3rd and 4th grade. Those word problems, we never could figure out why they made us do those and practice those. It's because we're gonna use them someday, and that someday is in quilting, where we need to figure out how many cuts of something we need and multiply that out to figure out the minimum amount of fabric, and then add that insurance policy. So it's going to take a calculator, a piece of paper, and a pencil to figure it out. But you usually are really comfortable then, because okay, I have this much extra. Most patterns will add a buffer in there for you to have at least 1 extra cut, but not all patterns are created equal.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know if I'm writing a pattern, I'll even put in fabric requirements 1/8 yard, and I always extra added just in case. I always just do 1/8 yard, just, usually it makes it a nice round number and stuff too. But like you said, there's never a reason to not have extra fabric. So use those to play around with new blocks or try out new things. And if you also want to try out something new, we have some activity pages that you can download and play around with. You can practice free motion quilting. I think we have some fun coloring pages. You can play around with some different blocks. You can download that by either clicking on the banner that's on your screen, or we'll put that in the comment section as well. All right, our next question's here. Jean says, hello from North Carolina. What is the easiest way to do Y seams?
Y seams take a little bit of time, and there are videos out there, some really great YouTube videos. I'm sure there's probably 1 or 2 at National Quilter Circle on creating those Y seams. It's kind of setting it up, laying it out in advance, so I'm going to join 2 pieces together first. I'm going to leave the seam allowance open at the end, because you're going to be adding in those other seams from other directions to get things to lie flat. The most critical things are accurate cutting, and accurate seaming. Those are vital to making those Y seams turn out beautiful and lay nice and flat. So it's a little bit too intense here for me to demonstrate a Y seam without a little bit of prep ahead of time, but search through National Quilter Circle. You're going to find some things on Y seams there, or even on YouTube. There are some good videos out there too. So Y seams always strike fear in the hearts of quilters when they hear them, because they think, oh no, but Y seams are not as bad as you think they're going to be. Usually you just have to remember to breathe and take it one step at a time, and you can accomplish those.
Yes. And of course, speaking of those videos on National Quilter Circle, we actually just had an instructor do 2 new videos for us. So Kelly Ashton, if you've not been familiar with her, she just did a couple. One is going to be on Y seams and one that's on partial seams, which is kind of the same sort of idea, but just done a little bit differently. And both those should be available on the site soon. So be looking for those. We have a couple more people just saying hi. We have Karen saying hi from Illinois. Wanda says hi, so happy to be here. And Wanda's question is, how do I get my sashing and cornerstones to come out properly? I always have trouble getting them to line up.
It could be there's 2 places to look, and usually when people have brought things to me and they're like, why didn't this come out right? Why didn't the seams intersect at the right spot? I usually, the first thing is to look to the back side, look to see if the pieces are cut properly. They have to be accurate because the math has been done so that things join together like a puzzle piece. And the other thing is the accurate 1/4-inch seam. If your seam's a little too deep or if it's a little too shallow, those easily can throw off those intersections where you want them to join nicely and have opposing seams, possibly when your cornerstone and your sashing intersect with your block. And it can be a combination of the 2. If your cutting isn't quite accurate and your seaming is a little off, then sometimes we get a multiplying effect there that can throw it off. Sometimes it just comes down to make it work. So go back and adjust. Maybe if the sashing and the cornerstone are extending beyond the block, maybe back it up, take a little bit deeper seam to make them join up. The problem kind of then falls into what happens when I add the next piece. You can sometimes get a doubling of that error and might throw the whole thing off. But sometimes done is good. When we get to the point where we can get the blocks together, understand maybe in the future, work on the cutting and the seaming to make sure they're accurate. Also make sure that in your pressing, that you pressed accurately. When we open blocks up, sometimes we don't open it all the way to the seam, and we get what's called a false ditch, so that it's not opened up all the way to the stitching, and that can throw things off a little bit too. So double check your pressing, finish the project. It doesn't have to be perfect. Go on to the next project. Just keep working on those skills to improve to your best.
Yep, absolutely. Every project is just another reason to practice something new or the same thing over and over again. You want to keep doing that. All right, our next one here, Nancy asks, what is the hard and fast rule? Border first on the top and bottom, or do you start with the sides, and why? I always forget this.
Hard and fast rules in quilting sometimes don't go together. Sometimes we do what we need to do. But in general, when you read patterns, they usually call for putting on the longest borders first, which tend to be, when you picture a quilt, we tend to picture it the long sides at the left and right, the short ends, top and bottom. For some reason, that's how we photograph quilts a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. So that you put the long pieces on first, and then usually it's the short borders. But double check your pattern, because of the way things are cut it's going to mandate how they're put together. Even in the project that I taught today, I put the long borders on first and then the short one on the end. If I were to try and do this in the opposite order and put the short one on first, it would have extended and been too long. So you really need to read the directions, follow how the instructor laid it out, and you'll be fine. But usually in general, we tend to do long borders first, trying to get those constructed and on first, and then the short ones.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. We have a couple more people that are popping on to say hi. Denise says hello from Quebec, and Corinne says hello from France. So we've got quite the viewership today from all over the place. So that is awesome. Our next question here, Jen asks, she says, I'm a new quilter and want to make a t-shirt quilt. I'm a little intimidated by the stretchy nature of t-shirt fabric. Any tips and tricks for making a t-shirt quilt for the first time?
Oh, there are lots of things to consider. T-shirt quilts are wonderful to create because they're filled with memories, and they take us on a journey. So as we're working on them, it takes us back to the places and the experiences and the people from our past. So t-shirt quilts, the biggest thing to do when I've worked on t-shirt quilts is to cut out the front of the shirt or the portion you're going to use, but cut it large to start out with. You're going to size it to the correct size eventually, but getting the sleeves and the back out of the way, or if you're using the back, the front out of the way, and that extra is really important so that it lays flat on your cutting surface. You're going to want to use a stabilizer. At least the majority of people who make t-shirt quilts use a stabilizer on the back. There are probably 3 or 4 different brands of stabilizers out there. Shapeflex is one of them. French Fuse is another. I think, Ashley, I've seen you use even another.
I use Stability.
Product. Yes. Okay.
Yep.
Exactly. I know that there's at least 3 really good ones out there. That put onto the back of the shirt will help with that stretch when you're trying to construct it, when you're cutting it out into the shape that you want. When you cut a t-shirt, or even when a t-shirt hem comes apart, you know that roll that happens. And the same thing will happen with a t-shirt. If you cut it without a stabilizer, edges tend to roll and distort, and then you have a challenge trying to get it into a quilt that has sashing or other blocks around it. So that going to find some videos on t-shirt quilts, getting a hold of that stabilizer. Any of those work really well on the back. Shapeflex, French Fuse, or the t-shirt one. Those are all made to add stability, but not weight and not make the t-shirts stiff. And so they still have that soft, flexible feel to them. If you are a quilter and you are working on t-shirt quilts, set your stitch length a little bit longer in case you need to take out any seams, because the short stitch length that we use in our piecing tends to kind of get buried in that knit, and then it's really hard to take out. The other thing is to be very careful of where your iron is. If you're adding sashing or anything to the outside of your t-shirt designs, those inks on there are very susceptible to heat. So you don't want to melt by touching the iron to those designs, because they can very easily be damaged that way. So just be aware of where your iron sole plate is at all times when you're working on a t-shirt quilt. But other than that, that gets you the basics of getting those stabilized, cut down, and the pressing with the stitch length just a little bit longer.
And I believe you've even done a video for us on National Quilter Circle on prepping your shirts and getting those, everything. So that video is available. And we also have a full-length class. Kelly Hansen taught one for us on t-shirt quilts. So it's an entire full-length class. And I believe you can also buy that class with a bundle of the Stability product as well. So and we have all those on the National Quilter Circle shop. So plenty of information and videos for you to reference for getting your first t-shirt quilt done. So I hope you have fun doing that. Another hello from Ontario, Canada. Gorgeous day here, and I just finished my second quilt ever, so that is awesome.
Yay, that's great.
All right, Marcia says, hello, ladies. Oh, this is a good one. We were just talking about this before we started, but she says, I love putting my blocks on point. Any advice?
On point is fun. Some people don't, not always, not their favorite. There are many choices for what to do, but on point means to take your block. It could be a piece block or a single block or a single piece like this, and sitting it on its point, basically stretching out. Blocks put on point make a quilt bigger faster because of the angle that they're set at. Be very careful about how you cut your setting triangles, the outer corners and the side setting triangles. Make sure that those are cut properly so that the bias edges are on the interior, that you have straight of grain on this outside edge, because when and if your quilt is then taken to either the long arm or you're going to quilt it, those edges can stretch out quite quickly if the bias is on that outer edge. So it will add great stability to your quilt and make it much easier to work with if you're adding even more borders to it or other piecing. So making sure that the bias is in the right place. One thing that I like to use is there are different tools out there for helping you cut those triangles for setting on point. And the easy diagonal sets from Fons and Porter is a really great tool that can help you cut those setting pieces on the outer edge from strips. So they make it a very efficient way to not have to cut big, huge squares and then cut them in both directions to try to get those quarter squares for the sides. That's a tool I like to use when I'm working with things on point.
Perfect. And we do have, I'm going to reference this again, another video on National Quilter Circle. This one was one a previous instructor did, Heather Thomas. And so if you have a pattern that you're reading that, is for like the one that you just did this morning, you give the directions of here's the size to cut. But say you're just making up your own pattern and you have a block and you want to put it on point. We have a video that tells you how to calculate how to cut those different triangles and which triangle needs to go where, because you have your setting ones and you have your ones in the corner. So great video on that if you want to make your own pattern and set those blocks on point. Dawn says that she loved your project today, Colleen. So awesome. Yes. Thank you for that. All right. Our next one, Bonnie asks, what is the best way to press a block to lay flat with bulky seams like a pinwheel block?
Okay. Sometimes there are points where we have bulk in a block and there's not much we can do in order to reduce it completely. We can alleviate it somewhat. On a pinwheel block, sometimes you can pop the seams in different directions so that last seam, as you join pieces together, you can get the seam allowances to do kind of a swirl, all going in one direction. So if you can pop that center open, then you can reduce the bulk in the very center of a pinwheel block. If you haven't done that before, go back to the Facebook Live that I did, pinwheel placemats, and I'll show you how to pop the center open on a pinwheel block in order to reduce that bulk. So that's only it's a short Facebook Live one that you could see that demo of how to reduce that. Otherwise, it's basically if you are working with something you have a lot of seams and it doesn't seem like you're going to be able to reduce the bulk at all, you can always go to pressing seam allowances open. It's not my favorite way to go. I'm not big at pressing all my seam allowances open, but there are times when it's called for and it does help alleviate the thickness. There are, you can alternate when you're putting rows together. I've been working on a baby quilt where it's all triangles. So as I put one row together of the triangles across, I made sure that all of my seam allowances are all pushed in one direction. The next row is pushed all the opposite direction. I can reduce that bulk at least somewhat by having them being opposed when they come together. At that point, though, I still have to press that seam allowance one direction to the other, and you just have to pick one and go with it. The biggest thing I think in the process of trying to get our seams to flatten is to always press our seams, press the rows before you open it up, press it, get it hot, because fibers that are warm will bend a little bit easier. So if you set the seam, basically you've done that last row of stitching and you lay it on the ironing board just as is and press it and get it warm, then open up to open this, get the seam to one direction. It does help sometimes to have that. Other people have found that the wool pressing mat helps with pressing because the wool pressing mat will absorb heat from the iron and help press from both directions. So if you haven't gotten to see one of those, a local sewing or quilt shop can give you a demo what those are like. Those might help also. But they also absorb some of the thickness so you don't get a shiny spot on your fabric as you're pressing. But we do the best we can, but not everything can be reduced.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, our next question here, Vaughn asks, do you ever fold the backing fabric to the front to use as the binding?
I have. I don't generally do that, but I have had people that I've long arm quilted for who wanted to do that, and that is totally acceptable to do. if I think back on the quilt, the one quilt that my one grandmother made for me, that's how she finished the outer edge, was that the backing fabric then rolled around to the front and became the binding. The only thing with that is that sometimes that binding is kind of thin, then there's only one layer coming around on that very edge, and the exact same thing happened to it as what we would say it will wear on that one layer of fabric. And so you get, over time, that will wear out. If it's a utility quilt, this is a great way to finish a utility quilt. It's going to be used, loved, and it's not like it's going to be an heirloom quilt. It's totally acceptable to do that. I do like to use French fold binding, which is like a 2.5 inch folded. So it's 2 layers coming around that edge, but that's just a personal preference. I've seen quilts finished with that, the backing come around, and it's even using a plush fabric, like a cuddle fabric, brought around to the front and then zigzag down. And because of that cut edge, you don't need to roll it a second time, and had a very nice finish on a quilt. So acceptable.
Good. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but we have a video on National Quilter Circle. But this is one where, because you mentioned the minky and cuddle fabric, and actually I take that back. This might even be on our sister site, National Sewing Circle, but it was using minky for the back of a quilt and folding it around. But then there also is, and I forget the name of it, but it's a little tool that you can lay down to help you be able to cut the corner, so you can easily miter that, like fold that corner into a miter. So Kelly Hansen, I believe, does that one for us as well. So that is on National Quilter Circle if you want a visual on how to wrap that backing around. And I can't remember the name of the tool, but it will help you cut it so it's the perfect size. So, all right.
The whole point of this community is to help you succeed. And we have brought together a wealth of knowledge, so use it.
Absolutely. All right. Sharon asks, I've never made a quilt. Is there a pattern for a beginner which would be easy?
Beginner. The easiest probably would be something, just a single one patch kind of quilt, something where you're just learning your cutting skills, getting used to using a rotary cutter and a ruler and mat, cutting squares, maybe say 10.5 inch or 8.5 inch, a one patch, basically just cutting squares and putting block to block. That's probably the best place to start, because what you really need to work at the beginning is the cutting skills and then the piecing and pressing. So getting into dicing that into more intricate pieces later, once you get that basics cutting and 1/4 inch seam accurate and the pressing skills, the sky's the limit on what you can do to cut that up and to make it even more intricate. So I'd say a one patch kind of thing, something with simple squares. Leave the triangles for at least quilt 2 or 3 down the line, because I love triangles and I always want to use triangles, but getting those basic skills figured out first, pick 5 or 6 fabrics, cut just simple squares, maybe arrange them in a diagonal row, is a great way to get started. So we're glad that you're here, that you're interested, and welcome to our community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say that for the first easy quilt that popped into my head was something like a rail fence, just strips. And because then you can use pre-cut fabrics and you don't even have to do as much cutting. So there are definitely easy ways to make your first quilt. All right. Sue asks, I just sewed 2 strips, 1.5 inches each together, then subcut to 1.5 inch strips to construct a 4-patch. But even though I'm matching the center seam, I keep getting fabric over on the top and the bottom. Any ideas why?
Well, without seeing it, it's kind of hard to diagnose. I would go back and double check that 1/4 inch seam. It really needs to be a scant quarter, and which means just a tiny bit short of a quarter. If you're using a 1/4 inch foot, there are ones that have a kind of a rail on one side. And if you push your fabric in there just a little bit too deep against that, you will get just a little extra in your seam allowance. So if it's taking too much out of the seam allowance, or if it's too shallow, that's the biggest thing to diagnose, to try and get that 1/4 inch seam as accurate as possible. Yep. So it's that, or it could be in the pressing, but as I say, close counts, but if you want to get into more intricate designs later, you need to be as accurate as you can attain.
Yep. That's what my first thought was, the pressing as well. And I know you just talked about it a little bit ago about that false ditch, not getting It pressed open all the way. So just, I don't know if you can touch on this a little bit in terms of pressing, but, when you're pressing open, say you're sewing together 2.5-inch squares, you can easily cover the entire area of that with your iron. But when you're pressing these thin strips, like 1.5-inch strips, and you're trying to press those, do you have any tips for how to make sure that you are accurately pressing those strips as opposed to,
Sure. Whenever we're doing strip sets, that can get kind of hairy, because if you put all your strips together and then you have all of these seams to press, that's really daunting and it's really hard to get at with the iron. Make sure that whenever you're doing a strip set that has multiple strips in it, join 2 together, then go to the iron and press. The other thing about even how you align them on the ironing board can make a difference. If you put them long way across the iron like this, over time, you will get just a little bit of an arch. And I don't know if it's the way we approach the iron or something, but they will bend just a tiny bit and get a curve in them. So if when you're working on strips, put them the short direction across your ironing board, it seems awkward, but it will keep you in line and straight, more efficient over the long run. But press that direction, have them going the short direction of your ironing board, so that you are really paying attention to getting that seam allowance open and that your iron isn't distorting it. If you're doing, say, a strip set that has 3 pieces in it, don't sew all 3 strips together right away. Do 2, go to the ironing board, get up, move, press that flat first, then join the 3rd. And then press that one, because that way you're only having to approach 1 seam at a time. And that way you can accomplish that without getting the iron knocked into the other seam and distorting anything. So always, if you're doing something that is 4 strips going together, do 2 and then do the other 2. Get those nice and flat, then join those together. Try to always, we as quilters, we want to stay at the sewing machine as long as we possibly can, but we really need to get up and go to the iron in between, because it does help with the accuracy and the neatness of our piecing and our units over time. So a little at a time.
I just set up my sewing room to where my iron is right here, and I don't have to get up. I just pivot. So I don't even,
Okay, pivot.
Exactly. All right. So we've got a lot of suggestions for the question we had previously on an easy quilt pattern for a beginner. We have a couple suggestions here. Christy recommends that block quilts are easier for beginners. So some very simple blocks for that. Another suggestion is that Katarina recommends a yellow brick road quilt. So similar to the rail fence, similar to that. I couldn't think of the word, something like that. And then Judy recommends table runners are a great idea for beginners too. So the couple that you have done for us, Colleen, and even the one you just did this morning. So all great suggestions. So thank you everyone for that. All right, our next one, Susie Q asks, I am playing with Crazy Quilt squares made with embroidery software. There's stabilizer, a foundation piece, and the pattern pieces that have the machine embroidered embellishments. How should these perfect square pieces be joined, and how would you quilt them, or would you just tie it?
Oh, there's a lot of possibility there. With Crazy Quilt blocks, you may want to do a small sashing between, depending on how much of that embroidery goes real close to the outer edge, or if it goes off the edge. And then when you join block to block, is it going to be disturbing to you, or very thick along those areas where that those stitches are going to be up against each other? A small sashing can alleviate that and have an easy time pressing and laying flat from block to block. Trying to think. Tying is an option, especially if you have a lot of embellishment there. It's less disturbing possibly for the crazy quilt stitches you've done and the design you've created. It also depends on how it's going to be used. If that's a quilt that you're creating that's just going to lay across the end of the bed and be a display kind of showpiece, or it's going to be displayed on a rack on the wall or in a room, then it doesn't probably need to be heavily quilted. So tying would be a really good option. It's kind of a traditional way to finish a crazy quilt. If you look back at historically what crazy quilts look like, a lot of times they were tied. just because of the thickness of everything that was going on. I think quilters were like, I'm not going to hand quilt that. So that may be a good option. So do a little research, see what you want it to look like at the end, because sometimes having that in mind, what you visualize, really does denote what direction you go in the finishing. If you want a little space between your blocks, and a sashing would be a good idea. But if you want a very traditional look, it could be block to block and then tied in the seam allowances. So, but double check how it's going to be used, if it's going to be on a bed, if it's going to be a display piece, on what you decide to do so that you tie close enough.
Yep, lots of options. All right, perfect. Our next one here, she says, not sure if you answered this already, but I've added an inner flange on my quilt, then added the borders. When done, the quilt seemed to pull up at the corners. Did I cut the material wrong or sew wrong?
Usually when we pull on the corners, and I don't know if you have your binding on yet, it tends to be that we've tugged a little bit or pulled a little bit. Sometimes a flange can add kind of a stiffness to that area. And I've done it myself, so I'm just as guilty as you are. But sometimes I've gone back and picked out certain areas where I felt like I had tugged on it a little bit and created a pull on the corners. And as I took out the stitches, everything kind of relaxed a bit. And even if you just gain like 1/8 of an inch, sometimes that's enough for it to lay flat. If you've already cut and put all your borders on, there might not be a lot you can do at that point. So it's probably not in the cutting. It's probably more in the stitching, and even the fact that the flange is a thicker edge and it kind of can do that pull as we put it on. It's just a tendency we as quilters, we want everything to match up, and if you tug it all, you'll get just a little bit of a pull on those corners.
And then a follow-up to that, in case someone is watching and does not know what a flange is. What is it?
Okay, a flange is a layer that is put between seams. It's usually cut like about 1 inch wide, folded, kind of like when you're folding binding. So it's wrong sides together. I don't have a piece of fabric right on me right now. And then it's inserted, so it kind of has a flap to it. So it gives a mitered look, kind of like if you look at a matted picture frame. So there's a color that runs around the edge there, but it's not actually stitched down. It's stitched in the seam allowance and put in as a folded piece. And it adds a lot of interest. It's an interesting way to put in a little extra color before you put your border on. But you have to be very careful when you're putting them in to not pull on them and to keep your 1/4 inch nice and even, because even a little wobble on a narrow piece is very, very easy to pick up with the eye. So you want to be very accurate when you put
Absolutely. It's definitely easier to see those little oopses on those little pieces as opposed to those larger ones. So
exactly.
Yep. All right. So Jean says that her first quilt was a jelly roll race quilt, which is very fun. So that makes me want to know what your first quilt was, if you remember.
My very first quilt? Oh my. I think, it wasn't a whole quilt. My very first thing I did was a 4-H project back in the 70s. You weren't even thought of yet. It was one block made as a pillow. It was a bear claw block, but it also has other names. I think Duck's Foot in the Mud was one of the names. It had triangle squares. In the 70s, I wasn't using a rotary cutter. I was using scissors. I hand quilted it and I had no idea what I was doing. I was a construction sewer and I was in 6th grade. So it's a little bit raw, but it got put together. But my first very big quilt was a kit that was handed to me from a quilt shop. And she said, here, make this as a sample. And it included strip piecing, set-in seams, fussy cutting, applique stars.
So just a little bit of everything.
And a pieced border. I don't know what she was thinking when she gave me that. I learned fast.
Can do it.
I do a lot of research.
Good. Perfect. All right. Our next question that just came in, Florence says, reading patterns is hard for me. Do you have any tips?
Reading patterns takes a little bit of time because we use acronyms, we use abbreviations. So sometimes just making sure we know what WOF means, width of fabric, or length of fabric. What does that mean? So learning those little nuances of the language of quilting. Whenever I would get, and when I still do, I pick up a new pattern. I look through the diagrams. I look at the actual the picture of the quilt, and then I kind of just go back and just lightly look through the directions, and then later I'll go back and actually read them intently. Because the idea is to get familiar in your head so that you see the different portions of it. You might not see exact construction yet, but then when you go to look at the diagrams, then it starts to, how is it broken down? How I'm not making the whole quilt at once. I'm making, blocks or units. And then you see that in the diagrams, then I would go back and read the instructions. So it's a little different because when you pick up a pattern, usually the first thing you get into is materials and then cutting. And that seems a really overwhelming way to go at it. It's the most logical way for us as quilters to gather up everything we need, but our brain has to kind of get comfortable with what we're going to attack. So I think by looking at the diagrams and trying to break it into portions, it makes it a little easier for us to digest and then go back to the directions and read maybe just a little at a time. Work on maybe just one unit at a time within it. Don't try to read all of it ahead because it can be daunting. But if we just look at one unit at a time, like I need to make hourglass blocks that go into a 9 patch. Okay, what do I need to use? Which fabrics? Identify those. Which do I need to cut for that? And then how they're constructed. Not all patterns are equal either. There are pattern writers that are good. There are ones that are excellent. And then there are some that are, so-so. Just like in everything, there's a different quality. If you are a very verbal person, if you like to see a video attached to it, look for quilters who add video to their sites so that you can watch things, so you can see it visually put together. If you are a reader, if words are your genre, that's what you like, look for those quilters who are very descriptive and then detailed in their pattern writing. For me, when I see lots of words, my eyes tend to glaze over. I want it boiled down to the nitty gritty. And I need really good diagrams because I'm a visual learner. So when I see diagrams, they make me happy. Right near what I need to put together. So before I purchase a pattern, a lot of times I'll peek on the inside and see what am I getting into here? Is this the deep end of the ocean? Is this written in paragraph format? Does it have a lot of good diagrams that are going to help me along the way? Do they have a website that might have video attached? So consider those things. But then there are always those patterns that we fall in love with and we just have to make. So sometimes it's call a friend. Help me get through this one step at a time. And so that's why quilt communities are so important. They can help us out. And when you look at directions and they're daunting.
Yeah. But well, and like you said, you figure out what way you like to read patterns. Like for me, if like you said, you like diagrams that make you happy, same thing. Like if there's a diagram, sometimes I won't even read the words. If I just recognize, oh, that's what we're making, like you can just make it. So diagrams are definitely helpful. And like you said, if somebody has a video that goes along with it, but also say you found this pattern that you absolutely love and you're trying to read it and it doesn't necessarily make sense, that doesn't mean that somebody totally non-related to that pattern hasn't done a video or a tutorial to help you through. So don't think that just because person A wrote the pattern, only person A can help you. Like there's many. Right. Speaking of different ways to approach patterns. So say you're looking at a pattern and you have to make a half square triangle or you have to make flying geese and the pattern tells you to do it one way, but that's not your preferred method. How do you adapt it to how you want to make it?
because I can't always hold all the information in my head at one time. That's why Google is so good of a crutch for us who can't keep all of it. Yes, when I find a pattern that has flying geese flying geese in it, I love triangles, and so if there are going to be 4 that are identical, and they do them the traditional method, which would be a rectangle and 2 triangles put together, or 2 squares, a rectangle and 2 squares with kind of flippy diagonal seams to make a flying geese unit. Yeah, I could do it that way, but if I can go and find the method for the 4 at a time, I'm going there, because I only have so many hours in the day, and I'm going to use every minute of it efficiently, sadly. So you can easily put in flying geese 4 at a time. It will give you the math. So there are diagrams out there, there are charts on all the techniques. So if you need to adapt, all you need to know is the height and the width of the finished unit. There are also cutting tools and trim tools out there to help you adapt. So if you own those, you can go to their reference of, okay, I need it to be 4 inches wide by 2 inches tall. Here is the cutting for that, because the cutting is going to be different than the traditional method. So if you've already cut them all in the traditional method, you're going to be doing it that direction. Yeah. You're just going to find some really good music or a book on tape to listen to while you're making in the traditional method. But if, as you get into it, you realize, oh, I could make these more efficient by doing an 8 at a time method or a 4 at a time method. I simply, like I said, I don't keep that in my head. I will bookmark it and go back to that reference so that I can use those cutting instructions to make multiple units at a time.
That's funny that you don't like the traditional method, because that is my preferred way. But I have to say, so this is just proves another point of why you should, like you said, read through that pattern first, glance through it all, because like you said, if you already cut those pieces, you're kind of stuck doing it that way. So if you want to change it up, you need to know that ahead of time. But just because I have one sitting here, so this is a little flying geese, so someone's never made one. If you are a beginner, since I know we've had a lot of people on here that are asking about beginner-friendly patterns or things, that are good for a beginner, which way would you do a flying geese? Because if you're going to do it with the triangle method, your way, you have those bias, that you're stitching on versus the more traditional straight, square, and rectangle way. So if you're a new quilter, a beginner, how would you approach the
I think as a beginner, it is really good for us to start with the basics. So the method that you used for making that flying geese unit with a brick, which becomes the triangle inside, and 2 squares, so that you're applying those to the corners and doing diagonal seams there and flipping them out. I would start with those. Understand and know the basic construction first. It's kind of like when we learned long division in school. They taught us the long, and then they taught us the short method. It was like, well, why didn't you teach me that first? Well, because I need to understand what I'm making. So I think learning those traditional techniques is core to understanding the whole process, because there are going to be times when you're going to use that traditional method, because maybe the flying geese in this pattern are all going to be different combinations of colors. So you can't make 4 at a time method, because those are all going to come out all identical, and you need it to be scrappy. So you need to know the basic methods, the most basic core methods to making those. So I think it's good to start with the basics, and getting a good foundation in any craft is always core to success. So stick with basics, and then you can branch out into the more crazy, let's do 8 at a time, or whatever method.
Well, and I mean, you'll never know that you dislike one if you don't try them all. So you have to, try them all at least once, so you know which one is your favorite, which one you prefer. Perfect. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I know we've talked about easy quilts and things for beginners. But so say you have done a bunch of your quilting of existing patterns, and now you're thinking about designing your own. How do you approach designing your first quilt or your first project that's not going to come 100% from someone else's pattern?
Designing can be daunting until you get into it. You think, oh, this will be hard. And then you get into it and you're like, oh my, now I know why I buy patterns. The biggest thing is to start with a grid. so that you know what you, kind of the basics of what you want to design. Say, for example, a 9-patch block. It's 3 blocks across, 3 blocks down. Design within that so that you have, if it's your first time kind of wading into design, so that you know, okay, each of these units, it has to be the same size when I'm done as I join them together. And then the math will be a little bit easier within that. It's when we kind of go rogue and start to just like, I'm just going to make a line here and I'm going to do this. And then you have to figure out, how am I going to actually even get these joined together or cut these pieces? Because I've now gone kind of off the grid and the math gets a little funky, and then that project ends up in the closet and never finished. So kind of wade in slowly and work within a grid so that you can then see how units within the block even play nicely together, how they come together, seams that match up. So think about those things when you start to design, and I think you'll have more success along the way. But
Yep.
Designing is fun.
It is fun. Are you one that
Don't
designs?
Forget your seam allowance.
Yeah. Are you one that designs on, pen and paper, or do you prefer a program?
I have used both. I've gone both directions. I need to update so that I have like Electric Quilt. I have an older version. I need the new version because the new version looks absolutely fabulous. But I also do just simple drawing it out and doodling while I'm watching TV. So I will, come up with an idea and a shade different ways. I've been using that to even come up with the last couple projects for the Facebook Live things. I'm like, well, let's just play with these pieces. And so sometimes inspiration comes from the fabric. Sometimes it's something I've seen before, but I want to adapt or I want to change up. So it kind of comes from every direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always just curious because I know I had quilters on here in the past too. An old friend of mine, Susan, she has an entire notebook that she draws out the entire quilt, and to me, I don't know that I have the patience to do that. Like, I need it on a computer screen and I just need to go. But I think it's cool to know the different ways that people do that. And Gil says that you've given me a bunch of ideas for my first quilt. So thank you for that.
Yay.
And something you just said is now going to spark a follow-up question to design. And that is, I know I could talk forever because as soon as you say something, it just gives me another question.
I know.
But are you someone who, because you mentioned some of your inspiration comes from the fabrics. So do you design a quilt for the fabric, as in like you already have the fabric in mind, or do you design a quilt and then go find the fabric to fit the design that you just designed?
Both. If you can do both, I mean, why pick one over the other, right? Sometimes because I've worked in quilt shops, a fabric line will come in and it just says, I have to go home with you. And so, but a lot of times I try to have an idea in mind before I go there, because I kind of know myself. I can be a fabric collector if I'm not careful. So, for example, let's see, pull this one up. It's not quilted yet, but it's a top. It's going to be there eventually. So I have a granddaughter coming in August. And I know that her mom loves kind of modern, just clean and simple, nothing real fussy. So when this one comes, I started looking at some fabrics and I was like, oh, I love coral, but I think that Cheyenne will like it too. And then I'm like, but I have to be kind of modern and clean and simple. So I stay with triangles, really simple, like banner shaped triangles, and try to stay with as clean a line and simple a design as possible. There ended up a little bit of floral in there, but just very simple design. And basically I was designing it on the design wall after I cut all the triangles, because it's just something that's very modern, kind of just organic. As it goes together, it goes together. Yes, I did rearrange colors a few times, thinking, ooh, too many navy blue over there, too many coral over here. But sometimes, and I picked all the fabrics and then said, what am I going to do with them? But then it was like, triangles. And a peak triangle was something I hadn't done a lot with. So that's the direction I went with that. Other times, like the one that I did this morning was a fabric line from Maureen McCormick, who was Marcia in the Brady Bunch. She's got a fabric line. And so I wanted just to use those little pieces whole so I could see all the color, because it reminds me of, well, the orange and yellow was a bedroom I had back in the 70s, but it also reminds me of that kind of the era of the daisy flowers and everything that, as a kid watching programs after school and then getting into 4-H and sewing. And so it all kind of just goes together. So design can come from a lot of places. Even when I've traveled, I've seen the most amazing tile floors and think those need to be a quilt someday. So inspiration sometimes leads, sometimes fabric leads. It just depends on what you run across.
Absolutely. I 100% agree about the floors as well. I think I've taken pictures of the Dallas airport floor so many times because they have these really cool mosaic, and I keep meaning to make a quilt out of it, but eventually. Corrine asks, for a big quilt, what is the best way to do the quilting? Assembling block by block quilting, like quilt as you go, or doing the whole thing and then quilting later?
Depends. Because it depends on what you're up for. If you have you've learned the technique of quilt as you go so that you could do it in rows. That's one I've been asked to cover for National Quilt Circle. So I'll probably be doing that in a Facebook Live at some point. So the quilt as you go technique. It does help with the weight of the quilt, getting it through, because you're going to be working on a strip or a portion of the quilt, quilting it, then joining them later, which does really help with the weight of pulling a quilt through the machine. Some people have have absolutely fabulous success doing quilting on their domestic machine, and hats off to them, because I can do up to probably a baby size quilt or a throw, and then after that I throw my hands in the air and it goes to a long arm. I'm just not good at manipulating all that fabric or basting close enough so that I can make the quilting look the way I want in the end. But patience, good basting skills, those are all core to getting a large quilt put through the machine to have it quilted. So basting is the most important thing, either pin basting or spray basting.
This is kind of a follow-up and along the same lines as what you're just talking about, but Judy says, what do you like and what do you dislike about quilt as you go patterns?
I guess the biggest drawback for me is I like to see that back fabric just be one continuous piece. I don't want to have to go back later and do that turn seam to close that on the back. And that's probably the only thing that kind of just gets on my nerves sometimes. It's like, oh, then there's a seam that I have to close down the back. But if your quilting is fabulous on those strips, then you can overlook that in the long run. So it really comes down to personal choice and whether or not, and maybe you're not using, extra wide backing because maybe you don't have access to it, or you can't find one that really goes with the genre of your quilt. So maybe that quilt as you go with the backing fabric that you absolutely love, maybe it's a print so that you can actually kind of camouflage that seam down the back and you won't see it when you're done and when you're complete. That makes a difference too on that finished project. So, And some of us, we just want to finish the whole quilt. We want to do the whole thing and that it's ours and we have ownership of it. So that's totally fine to do it that way.
Absolutely. A little comment here. Patricia says she can't wait for the next class. So I'm not sure if she's referring to the one you just mentioned, but whichever one that you have upcoming, she's going to be waiting to see that. And I'm going to be very interested to watch your quilt as you go as well, because I think we do it, not surprisingly, we do it differently. I think you and I are opposites on lots of things, but I've never done them in a strip. I've always just done them block at a time. And I sew the backing together, and then I end up usually with a sashing strip or something to cover it up in the front. So I have a completely different method. So I think there's, there's obviously many different ways that you can do one thing. So you'll have to teach your way, and I'll do my way, and then we'll have a quilt as you go.
Everybody has an option.
Exactly. Perfect. All right. One last question here. Because you were holding up your two quilts that you showed, the baby quilt that you did and the project from earlier, and we were talking about design, and in both of those quilts, I noticed quite a few prints, which is again something that you and I are different on. I don't think I've made a quilt with more than one print fabric in it ever. So how do you decide how many prints versus how many solids? How do you balance it out, not making it too busy, things like that?
Aha. Okay. Yes, I definitely do love prints. That's for sure. This project was predetermined because I used the 2.5 inch pre-cut squares. So pretty much everything was in except for like 4 pieces. So at this point, it was all in. I used the white to create kind of a visual break before I went to pick a stripe and a print that were from the line. Now this stays all within one fabric line. So you kind of know everything goes together. Now over here on this one, I started with the coral and the blue. Those were going to be the colors I wanted to go. And this print, this kind of zigzag print, had those colors in it. So that was my paint chip, if you will, that I went from. So it has a light gray, kind of a medium blue gray, and a navy in there. So there's 3 colors there. And then there's a peach and a coral, both. So I use that as my cheat sheet of colors. And then knowing that you're going to be bringing 6 pieces together when you're using triangles like this, so the points come together, you're going to need to be on more fabric than less, because when you're trying to do scrappy, you don't want them to touch maybe point to point or right next to each other. So more works better for getting the arrangement to be scrappy. So I picked, let me think. I think there are 4 coral kind of colors in here, ranging from really light to very dark. Then I had 3 navy blues because I needed that dark in there just for some depth. I needed a little bit of light, so I have 1 white print and 1 very light gray background print, just because if I went all color, it was getting too dark, too muddy. So I needed to bring a little light into it, but not too much, so that it shows if it gets used a lot. Don't want it to be too light. And then, so that's kind of how I built that. Not to be too navy blue, a little bit more on the coral, a little deeper in that area because it's a girl quilt. And then just enough light to kind of spark kind of a glimmer of light into there, so it's not all dark. But it's a challenge. Sometimes you pull and you don't have enough and you have to go back and buy more. Quilt shops are loving that you want to go shopping. Mm-hmm. So, but more tends to make it easier for a scrappy arrangement than if you're locked into like 3 or 4. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, perfect. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here to answer everyone's questions for the past hour, giving us a lot of information on design, on basic blocks, things that you can practice on and work on getting to become a master quilter like yourself. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.